Imagine stepping into a world where the sun itself seems to hate you. The year is 1864. The Civil War is devouring America from both ends. But for thousands of captured Union soldiers, the war was not over. It was only beginning again, in a place far worse than any battlefield. A place called Andersonville. When you hear the word prison, you might picture walls, cells, guards, maybe even a chance of freedom. But Andersonville was no prison. It was an open grave. 26 acres of raw, sun-scorched mud enclosed by towering wooden stockades. No roof, no beds, no mercy. Men didn't just live here, they rotted here. For every breath they took, another man took his last. The air itself smelled of decay, of death and despair so thick you could taste it on your tongue. And yet somehow some still clung to hope. They believed the war would end soon, that a prisoner exchange would save them, that God was watching. But as the days passed and the bodies piled up, hope began to die, one heartbeat at a time. Could you survive this? Could you stand under a burning Georgia sun, hungry, filthy, surrounded by death, and still believe you'd make it home? Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will test your courage more than any battle ever could. They came from all walks of life. Farm boys from Ohio, factory workers from New York, teachers, husbands, sons. They had fought bravely in the fields of Chickamauga, Chattanooga, and Missionary Ridge, but one by one they fell into Confederate hands, tired, wounded, half-starved already. When the gray-clad soldiers surrounded them, they thought, "At least we'll live." They didn't yet know that Andersonville would be worse than death itself. They were loaded into cattle cars, packed so tight that no one could sit or breathe. The summer heat turned the metal cars into ovens. The stench of sweat and fear filled the air. "Where are we going?" someone asked. No one answered. Hours passed, then days. The doors finally slid open, and the sunlight revealed a nightmare. Before them stretched a valley surrounded by walls of sharpened logs, a gate like a fortress, and beyond it, a sea of ragged, dying men. Some were nothing but skeletons with skin. Some were crawling in mud, too weak to stand. Some were whispering prayers. The new arrivals stared in horror. This couldn't be real, but it was. A Confederate guard smirked and shouted, "Welcome to Andersonville!" The gates creaked open. The prisoners were shoved inside, and when the gates slammed shut behind them, they knew they weren't soldiers anymore. They were captives in hell. What would be your first thought stepping through those gates? Anger, fear, or disbelief that your own country had come to this? The rules at Andersonville were simple and deadly. Inside the walls, a rough wooden fence ran a few feet from the perimeter. The space between that fence and the wall was called the deadline. It wasn't just a name. Cross it, even by accident, and you were shot on sight. Guards perched high above the walls, rifles always ready. Sometimes they fired just to remind the men that mercy didn't exist here. Imagine standing in a sea of thousands, shoulder to shoulder, every movement dangerous. You couldn't stretch your legs without fear. You couldn't breathe deeply without smelling rot and human waste. Some men went mad and ran for the fence, screaming for freedom. They never made it. One prisoner wrote, "The deadline is where men go when they forget hope." The rest of them learned to live within those invisible walls, not of wood, but of fear. Every sunrise brought new bodies. Every sunset buried what was left of humanity. Could you stand still while death stood only a few feet away waiting for you to slip? Could you keep your sanity while living like this day after day? Through the center of the camp ran a narrow, muddy stream, Stockade Creek. It looked harmless enough at first, but this little stream would become the greatest killer inside Andersonville. At the top of the camp, Confederate guards in kitchens dumped waste, food scraps, and excrement directly into it. By the time the water reached the prisoners at the bottom of the slope, it carried filth and disease. Yet the men had no choice. They drank it. They bathed in it. They washed their open wounds in it. And the creek repaid them with agony. Dysentery ripped through the camp like wildfire. Men wasted away in days. The ground turned soft from the number of graves dug each morning. And still, no one helped them. A few whispered prayers to God, others cursed him. The guards laughed from the walls. Some prisoners claimed the water was cursed, that the devil himself flowed through that stream. Others said it was simply the work of men who had forgotten compassion. If you were dying of thirst, would you drink from that stream, knowing it could kill you? These were the choices at Andersonville, not between life and death, but between one kind of death and another. When starvation becomes your only companion, even brotherhood begins to rot. At first, men shared what little they had, a scrap of bread, a handful of beans, a drop of clean rainwater caught in a tin cup. But hunger is patient. It waits. It whispers. And soon, it turned the camp into a hunting ground. A gang rose from the shadows, stronger men, ruthless, organized. They called themselves the Raiders. They stole from the weak, beat the helpless, and murdered anyone who stood in their way. At night, their silhouettes moved like ghosts between the tents of rags. A groan, a shout, then silence. The guards didn't care. The fewer mouths to feed, the better. Fear spread faster than disease. Even friendships dissolved. Who could you trust when your tentmate might slit your throat for a crust of cornbread? A preacher among the prisoners wrote in his diary, "Hell itself could learn cruelty from these men. Could you keep your soul when survival means becoming the very thing you hate? Would you fight back, or join them just to live another day?" One morning, the camp awoke to screams. The Raiders had killed a man in broad daylight. For a spoon, that was the final straw. From the crowd emerged a group of men, battered, hollow-eyed, but burning with fury. They called themselves the Regulators. Led by Sergeant Peter McCullough, they made a promise. "If the guards won't give us justice, we'll make our own." Over the following days, chaos turned to revolution. Prisoners armed themselves with sticks, stones, and sheer rage. They hunted the Raiders through the camp, dragging them from hiding one by one. For the first time, the guards looked down and saw order born from desperation. A trial was held, a court of starving men under a tattered flag. Witnesses stepped forward, voices trembling. The verdict was swift: guilty. On July 11, 1864, the Regulators executed 6 Raiders before the entire camp. No one cheered. No one spoke. Only the wind moved through the stillness. In that moment, Andersonville changed, not for the better, but for something closer to justice. Would you have stood with the Regulators, or stayed silent, afraid to become the next target? Amid the filth and fever, a few men still clung to words, letters written on scraps of cloth, bark, or the backs of playing cards. They wrote to wives who would never receive them, to mothers who would wait by the window, watching for sons who'd never come home. "Dearest Sarah," one letter read, "if this reaches you, know that I died thinking of your face. Tell our boy his father was not a coward, only a hungry man who wanted to see him again." Those letters never left the camp. Many were buried with the men who wrote them. But somehow, a few survived, smuggled out by newly released prisoners. Their words became the only witnesses left. These weren't soldiers anymore. They were ghosts writing their own eulogies. If you could write one last message from a place like this, what would you say? Would you beg forgiveness or ask to be remembered? The summer of 1864 was merciless. The sun scorched the camp until the ground cracked. Flies blanketed the dead faster than they could be buried. Men prayed for rain, any relief from the torment. Then, on August 9th, the sky answered. A thunderstorm rolled in with apocalyptic fury. Lightning ripped across the sky, striking inside the stockade. The ground trembled, and from the split earth burst a fountain of pure water. The prisoners fell to their knees. They drank, bathed, wept. Some called it Providence Spring, a miracle sent by God Himself. For a brief moment, the camp felt alive again. Hope shimmered between the raindrops. But miracles are fragile things. Within weeks, disease and starvation reclaimed the camp. Still, that spring kept flowing, clear and defiant, as if heaven refused to abandon them entirely. Do you believe it was coincidence or divine mercy? And if you had been there, would you have seen the spring as a sign to fight on, or a cruel reminder of everything you'd lost? The miracle of the spring faded fast. Hunger doesn't care for miracles. Disease doesn't bow to faith. By late summer, Andersonville had become a nightmare even the guards wanted to forget. Rations dwindled until men survived on handfuls of cornmeal mixed with bugs. Flesh clung to bone. Eyes sank deep into skulls. The average man weighed less than a child. Some prayed for exchange, but that promise was long broken. The Confederacy could barely feed its own, and the Union had decided no more prisoner trades. They believed ending exchanges would shorten the war. Inside Andersonville, it only shortened lives. "We were sacrificed for victory," one survivor wrote. "Forgotten by our generals, forgotten by our God." But even as men collapsed around them, a few refused to die quietly. They built crude shelters from sticks and rags. They formed prayer circles, shared songs, and carved names into wooden scraps so the world wouldn't forget them. That's what war does. It tests not just your body, but your soul. Could you still believe in your country after it left you to starve? Would you hold on to faith, or let rage take its place? The war was ending. Sherman's army marched through Georgia, burning the Confederacy to ashes. When Union troops finally reached Andersonville in May 1865, they expected to find prisoners. What they found instead was a graveyard that still breathed. Skeletons in blue rags stared at them with hollow eyes, too weak to stand, too stunned to believe rescue had come. A Union officer wrote, "We thought we had seen war. We were wrong." The surviving prisoners were evacuated, and the dead were buried in what became Andersonville National Cemetery. But justice was waiting for one man, Captain Henry Wirtz, the commandant of Andersonville. His trial became one of the first war crime hearings in American history. Witness after witness described starvation, cruelty, neglect. Wirtz claimed he was following orders. The jury saw only guilt. On November 10th, 1865, Henry Wirtz was hanged in Washington, D.C. His last words, "I am being hanged for obeying orders." Some called it justice, others called it revenge. Do you believe Wirtz deserved his fate? Or was he a scapegoat for a nation desperate to forget what it allowed to happen? After the war, life went on. Towns were rebuilt, soldiers returned home, and the Union celebrated victory. But for 13,000 men, home would forever be a patch of Georgia soil. The Andersonville cemetery became sacred ground. Simple wooden markers, then marble stones, each bearing a number, a name if one was known. Clara Barton herself came to help identify the dead. She walked the fields with lists of names, determined to give dignity back to the forgotten. Imagine her voice breaking as she read the names aloud one by one into the silence. Today, those graves stretch as far as the eye can see. The birds sing, the grass sways. But beneath that peaceful surface lie the echoes of agony. Here, one survivor later said, lies the proof that liberty has a price. Would you walk among those graves? Would you feel pride or shame, knowing what was endured to preserve a flag? Time heals, but it never forgets. The story of Andersonville isn't just about suffering. It's about endurance, memory, and the terrible cost of division. Every war has its battlefields, but some wars have prisons, where men fight not the enemy but themselves. Today, Andersonville stands quiet, a museum, a cemetery, a warning. Visitors walk the path where thousands once wasted away. They read the names, see the relics, feel the silence. And for a moment, the world slows down, because in that silence you can almost hear them, the voices of the forgotten whispering, "Remember us." Will you? Please, you must. If this story moved you, if you believe the past must never be buried, then subscribe, not for me, but for them. Because every view, every share, every comment keeps their memory alive. They died in silence. But you can make sure they're never silenced again.